What's up, guys? It's Brandon Flash. You're joining me at a Tesla Supercharger, and this video we're going to do a deep dive of the Model 3 rear-wheel drive lithium iron phosphate battery charging curve over multiple sessions that I've recorded across multiple days. And fast forward to future Brandon here. We're back in North Carolina. I recorded quite a few charging sessions when I was in Texas about a month ago with a Model 3 rear-wheel drive LFP or lithium iron phosphate. And I wanted to go over all these different charging sessions that I recorded and also make a recommendation on how you should use this Model 3 when you're on a road trip and how you should charge it, because it doesn't charge like some of the other EVs that I've had in the past, and it has a somewhat unpredictable-ish charging curve because it seems to vary depending on where you plug it in, and it's also extremely temperature dependent. So today we're going to be going over 5 different charging sessions, 2 different deep charging sessions ending at 90% and 100%. We're also going to be doing kind of 2 middle of the curve charging sessions, so a 15 to 57%, a 23 to 65%, and then also a 48 to 94%, kind of simulating as if you were stopping pretty early in your trip if you started with a 100% charge. But also, it's worth noting that Tesla actually recommends charging this Model 3 rear-wheel drive LFP up to 100% at least once a week. However, if you're on a road trip, my recommendation would be to not charge to 100% when you're supercharging, because it really doesn't make sense from an efficiency standpoint. Because it takes so much time to go from that 90 to 100%, as you're going to see here shortly. So definitely, if you're going to charge to 100%, which is recommended, because that helps calibrate the Model 3 rear-wheel drive LFP battery pack, or any LFP battery pack actually, do that when you're at a hotel and you have slow charging. You're able to do that overnight. And the reason that you need to charge these LFP batteries to 100% is actually because as the battery discharges, the voltage in the battery pack actually doesn't vary very much. So typically in an NCM battery, or nickel, cobalt, manganese, something like that. Sorry, not a battery chemistry expert, but I know enough to be dangerous. As the battery pack is charged more, it actually increases in voltage. So if you have like a Rivian R1T or most other Tesla models, when you're at like single digit percentages, you're going to be at a lot lower voltage than if you were at 100%. So my Rivian, for example, can be in the high 300 range for voltage when it's at low single digits. But then when it's fully charged, it's at about 450 volts. So that actually does impact the performance as well, because as you're at a higher state of charge and you have higher voltage, the vehicle can output more power. But what you'll experience if you drive a Model 3 rear-wheel drive LFP is that actually as the battery goes down, the performance doesn't change very much, which actually makes it a very drivable vehicle. And I think really is actually great for everyday usability. You can use 100% of the battery, which you cannot do on most of EVs, and you can actually use it really well. So without further ado, let's dive in. We're going to start with an 8 to 100% charging curve, and we're just going to go ahead and play that back. I have the 8 to 100% charge. My apologies, I didn't start the timer right away, but we see this shoot right up to about 171 kilowatts, which is pretty excellent. And we're starting at 8%. This is at 1,000% accelerated video. It shoots down pretty quickly here, down to 140s, but then starts to slow. It's dropping. We're already up to 20% after less than 4 minutes. And you can see this is just kind of cranking along here. It's worth noting that my efficiency over the 1,000 miles that I was driving this in Texas was actually 282 watt hours per mile. So when we crossed 28 kilowatt hours added, that's approximately 100 miles of real world Texas driving range that was added. And we get to that pretty quickly here, you'll see that. But we're still over 100 kilowatts after about 10 minutes, almost to 40% now, pretty excellent. Frankly, I'd probably be unplugging pretty quickly here depending on how far I need to go, but we'll get to my whole charging recommendation here pretty quick. Just now getting down to right about 100 kilowatts as we cross 50% or so roughly. But overall, that's a pretty solid charging curve so far, up to 50%. We're getting close to that 28 kilowatt hours added, which is 100 miles driving range. And I do have the charging limit set to 100%, but that doesn't impact how it charges up until that point. There we go, 28 kilowatt hours added at about 56% after 15 minutes from 8%. Pretty awesome. And we're still going along. It's still holding pretty steady in that 80 kilowatt range and dropping very slowly. If you're used to older Teslas, you'd be expecting this to drop a lot more quickly, but it's not. And we're just about to cross over to the 20-minute mark. And then we'll add about 38 kilowatt hour, pretty close. And here we are at about 70%. I would have been gone by now personally, but again, we'll get to that here shortly. Still at about 70 kilowatts, which is pretty strong at 70%, especially compared to other Teslas. And it's still just cranking along, really not dropping that aggressively. So a pretty strong C rate as we get towards the top. This is about a 62-ish kilowatt hour battery, a little bit less usable. So really not that large of a battery, and to still be over 1C charging rate is quite excellent. But now it's starting to kind of slow down. We're under 60 kilowatt, which is under 1C, and we're getting close to that half an hour mark. And really, if you're charging more than about half an hour or even 25 minutes on a Model 3 LFP, in my opinion, you're kind of doing it wrong. And here we can actually see that IDOT, and even though I cropped it out, the warning for battery almost full, and that it charges slower as you get towards those higher state of charge is actually popping up. So that way it's kind of warning you, hey, you don't actually need to be plugged in still. You can keep going. You've reached enough to reach your destination, and it's just charging pretty slowly. We're under 50 kilowatts at this point as we get close to 90%. And when we go into the top charging curve, you'll see that this varies depending on where you start it. So I think it possibly is a bit thermal management related, but also the battery management has to keep track of how much energy is added to manage those voltages, because again, LFP means that the voltages don't vary that much, even when you're charging, which makes it more challenging for the vehicle to know where you're at state of charge when charging. About to cross 50 kilowatt hour added here after about 37 minutes. And we're over 90%, and it's just crawling along at this point. We're under 40 kilowatts in the low 30s. And there's really not much reason you should be charging at this point still on a DC fast charger unless you absolutely need the range. But in a Tesla, unless you're really out remote, you really shouldn't need to charge to 100% pretty much ever at a supercharger. I could see maybe if you're starting from home or something, sure, charge to 100% when you're not waiting on it. But if you're waiting on it, there's really no benefit to doing this. I mean, get a meal, I guess, if you need to charge this fast, because it is still relatively reasonable to 100% under 1 hour. We're getting close to 45 minutes at 99%, and that last 1% is going to take a little while, and it really adds pretty limited benefit when you're doing it on a DC fast charger. Because here we're just cranking along at 99% at single or almost single digit kilowatt, about 10 kilowatt. And so now it actually switches to calibrating, and we're at 48 minutes for 99%. And it's just gonna still sit there for another few minutes at only 9 kilowatt. Keep in mind, this is still faster than AC charging because the Model 3 standard range, or LFP, is limited to 32 amps, which is about 7 kilowatts with AC onboard charging. So still slightly better, but still really slow and not something I would personally want to be waiting on. And we're just cranking away. It's still been another almost 10-ish minutes, something like that, since we crossed 99%. Definitely unplug, leave, get on the road. It's not worth waiting for this while you're on a DC fast charger. And hopefully it's wrapping up here shortly at 100%, but just so you can see what that looks like. And it's still calibrating single digit kilowatt, 2 kilowatt at 99%, which it's just top balancing those cells to make sure they all get to the same point. So hopefully seeing that kind of made a point of why it doesn't make any sense to charge to 100% on a DC fast charger. You certainly can do it. And if you're doing something else and you happen to let it go to 100% on a DC fast charger, well, I guess that's fine. Don't let it sit there just like any other EV. But if you're trying to be time efficient, it really makes absolutely no sense. But let's move on to the 48 to 93% kind of middle of the curve, or deep charge part of the curve, just so you can see how it handles that. Let's dive right in. So here you can see we're starting at 48%, jumps right up to 140 kilowatt even at 50%, which is more than we saw in the previous charge recording from starting at low state of charge. Pretty quickly, still holding over 100 kilowatts, but it is dropping down relatively quickly. And this is a pretty short recording because we can only add so much energy when we're at 50 or 48% starting, but still over 90 kilowatt there at just coming close to 60%. And it's just kind of cranking along, but it shows that this curve is actually pretty steady. For some reason, I do recall it being a bit better than this at higher state of charge, so I'll have to see if these other recordings support that. But the vehicle does seem to vary its curve based on the calibration it has for the battery pack. So definitely charge it to 100%, and that does seem to help calibrate it at the top, and it charges differently as a result of that. So keep that in mind if you have one of these Model 3s, that even on a road trip, you should try and make an effort to charge it to 100% if you can get a hotel charger or something, because it does want to be calibrated towards that top. And here we go, we're at about 10 minutes. We've gone from 48 to 73%. That's pretty strong. So if you're on a road trip starting at 100%, if you're with family, kids, dog, whatever, and you need to make kind of an early stop at the closest supercharger, most likely if you're starting from a metro area, restroom break, snack break, whatever, that 10 minutes is actually still pretty useful. And you're getting still pretty close to back up where you started in a pretty brief stop. So Model 3 is definitely one of those vehicles that opportunity charging, if there's DC fast chargers, which with a Tesla with the Supercharger network, there pretty much always are chargers available if you're going on a pretty commonly traveled route. So definitely try and make any of your stops that you have to make for any other reasons at a supercharger. Most likely there should be some decent amenities. A lot of the newer superchargers that Tesla's been putting in are actually at pretty good locations. And here we're getting up to almost 90% already, 85% at 17 and a half minutes. Pretty strong. 50 kilowatts, just dropped below that at 85%. And really not bad. I think we'll get to 90% in about 20 minutes or so. And while I personally wouldn't do this if I didn't have a different reason to stop and plug in, because this doesn't make sense just from a charging perspective to do this kind of charging session, it is still good to know what the vehicle is capable of at these higher states of charge if you do need to plug in and take advantage of charging when it's available. So we're just wrapping up this session here as we get close to 93%, and hopefully this is pretty useful here. Yeah, 23 minutes to 93% from 48. Not bad at all. All right, so we did that 48 to 93% curve, and you can kind of see why that generally wouldn't make sense, but given the supercharger network and the density of the coverage, pretty much any stop you make should be at a supercharger, in my opinion, unless you really have a reason to stop somewhere else. But now we're going to go into a 4 to 90% charging curve, which I think is a lot more reasonable charging session if you really need a lot of range for your next leg. But let's jump into that. So here we are starting at 4%. Apologies for the shoddy camera work here. Again, immediately shot up to just over 170 kilowatts and moving fairly quickly. And I think this is a pretty normal use case of how I would do it if I was kind of really ripping on it, or if I really needed the range to make it to the next stop, or if I wanted to skip a stop, depending on the spacing of the superchargers. We're already below 170 or below 150 kilowatts. So this kind of shows that the Model 3 rear wheel drive, even if you only have a version 2 supercharger, it's still pretty useful and really doesn't make that much of a difference in your charging, because this car doesn't really need a version 3, which does really open your options as far as superchargers, because a lot of corridors only have version 2. I'm thinking of I-70, I-40, things like that. But here we're just over 5 minutes. We're already up to about 30%, really strong. I did calculate the average for this charging session to be of 89.5 kilowatts. So that's about 1.5 C for a 4 to 90% charging session, which is really, really strong in my opinion. And this was with fairly warm weather. You can see if depending on where I crop this here, that's about 80 degrees outside, and we're in Texas in February, but just holding really strong, about over 110 kilowatts up until 43%. And then we're already up to 50%, you'll see in just a moment here, after under 15 minutes. And again, watch for that magic 28 kilowatt hour added, because that's when you've added about 100 miles of real world Texas driving range. And then depending on what part of the country you're in, that could be even more range, because these cars are just crazy efficient. So there we have 28 kilowatt hour. We're just getting under 100 kilowatt charging rate at 54%. And there we have 15 minutes, 55% from 4%. So you're already adding over 50% in about 15 minutes, which is a really good charging stop. If this is at a convenience store, gas station that's really easy to get on and off, there's a good chance you've probably already run in, used the restroom, grabbed food, snack, whatever. And especially if you have kids, dog, whatever, there's a good chance the vehicle is going to be ready to go before you are in this case. And we're still at 80 kilowatts, all the way up at 64%. And we're only just now in minutes here, crossing 20 minutes, already up to 67%, still at 75 kilowatts. And just, man, this car just charges great. And combined with the efficiency of this car, you can just really pile on the miles with this, even though it doesn't have a ton of range, it doesn't have a huge battery, but the combination of readily available fast charging and the crazy efficiency leads to just being able to pound the miles out. And we're getting close here to 80%. And people always say 80% is kind of the magic point, but really vehicles reduce their charging rate well before 80%. It's just a lot of older vehicles at 80%, they would really drop their charging curve. But I don't know, I say unplug generally earlier than 80% in most cases, but you'll see here, we're gonna cross 80% at 27 minutes or so, and still at 56 kilowatt, which is just under 1C. And we're gonna continue until 90%, just so that we can see that here. And like I mentioned, we're doing 89.5 kilowatt average, all the way up to 90% from 4% on a vehicle with a 60 kilowatt hour battery, which is just awesome. Still at 50 kilowatt, just about to drop below that at 83% at about 30 minutes. So 30 minutes is kind of the benchmark for a lot of charging sessions. I personally try to keep it under 20 when possible, but 30 minutes is a pretty reasonable stop after you've probably driven 100, 150, maybe even 200 miles, depending on where you are and where you started from. And we're gonna get close to 50 kilowatt hour added here as we get to 90% in about 34 minutes. Or 35 minutes, something like that. But you'll see that here in just one moment. 50 kilowatt hour here, and just about to complete here at 90% in just shy of 35 minutes. And there you can see the 4 to 90% charging curve, which is a good example of a deep charging curve on this LFP battery. Maybe not the most efficient way to be charging this vehicle and then continuing on a road trip, but I think a pretty good real world example of what people will actually do, because most people are not like Kyle and I, where we're trying to cannonball across the country. But coming up here, this is when I'm going to get into kind of maximizing your time strategy. So we have a 15 to 56% charging curve, and then we have a 23 to 64% charging curve. And if you kind of combine these two to get a more broader range and combine with stopping earlier on that 4 to 90%, you can kind of see where I'm getting at as far as my recommendation for actually charging this on the road. And both of these next two charging sessions will add 24 kilowatt hour to the battery. So let's jump into the 15 to 56% charging, so you can see just how quick that is. So here we have 15%, immediately shoots right up to 171 kilowatt. It seems to max out at that, even though they claim 175 kilowatt max. And you can see we started at 15%, and it's just cranking along here. This was just south of Dallas, I believe, as we're heading into Dallas, and you'll see how quickly it switches to the 5 minutes remaining to continue on your trip, and then able to continue on your trip, even with a pretty low state of charge still. So less than 5 minutes, we've already added over 10 kilowatt hour. We're at about 35% state of charge. So really just kind of cranking along there. And still 130 kilowatts at 36%. And this is just a great example of how quickly you can move on with this battery pack. And then we'll switch here just in a second to ready to continue on your trip. And 100 kilowatts at 42%, holding pretty strong. And then we're just going to be dropping under 100 kilowatts as we get closer to 50%. So there we have enough charge to continue on your trip. Didn't want to let go of that 100 kilowatts. So 99 kilowatts at 47%, really good. That's still over 1.5 C on this tiny battery. And we're just crossing 10 minutes. We've added 20 kilowatt hours. So that's about 80 miles of range or so. And both of these sessions, 24 kilowatt hour, and it's probably about 80 miles of range added compared to 100 miles at 28 kilowatt hour. And here we have, we're just wrapping up this charging session, still over 90 kilowatts. So that's a really good example of how to really optimize and unplug, because when we unplugged, we were still at 90 kilowatts, so 1.5 C on that battery, and really just making sure you're maximizing the power that it can take in. So let's dive into that second charging session, 23 to 64%. And then after that, we'll kind of wrap all this up and I'll conclude my recommendations to you. So this next session, again, 23%, we jump right up to 172 kilowatts this time instead of 171 kilowatt, again, dropping down pretty quickly, but then leveling off as we get to about 140 kilowatts. And these sessions are actually nearly identical, adding the same amount of energy in just about the same amount of time, but at different points in the battery pack, shifted up about 7-8% here compared to the previous session, but still just cranking along. We're trying to really maximize the speed that this is at. So we're over 2 Cs. So the Model 3 LFP is actually one of the fastest charging Teslas by C rate and how well it holds it into the battery pack. So it's actually, in some ways, a better charging vehicle than even the Model S Plaid and the bigger battery pack cars, because of that LFP tech and how well it can handle and actually enjoys the heat that charging gives it. So crossing 50% here at just under 8 minutes from 23%, still 115 kilowatts at 52%. Really, really strong, especially coming from my old Model S 70D that just charged so poorly with a pretty similar efficiency in charging rate and battery pack size. So these cars are just magically efficient, and crossing 60%, still over 90 kilowatts. We're gonna be wrapping up here in just a second. 24 kilowatt hour at the end as we approach 64%, and really no reason to continue charging. You can just keep going. So those last two sessions, the 15 to 56%, we actually averaged 115 kilowatt average. We added 24 kilowatt hour in 13 minutes, and this most recent one we just watched together, that was 23 to 65% with 105 kilowatt hour average, adding 24.48 kilowatt hour in 14 minutes. So truly excellent charging there, especially when you look at it from a C rate. As far as my recommendation would go, when you're on a road trip with this Model 3 rear-wheel drive, generally I would recommend pulling it as low as you can, somewhere around that 5 to 10% mark, depending on your comfort level with an EV. And I think with the Tesla, there's a lot of comfort to be had. You're getting real-time status, you're getting real-time rerouting depending on supercharger availability. If they're busy, the Tesla Nav will actually route you to a different supercharger if you have that option, depending on your range and depending on the density of the superchargers in your area. So I'd say there's really not a whole lot of reason to not pull into a supercharger with pretty low state of charge, and actually only charge enough to make it to the next one with, again, that safety buffer depending on your comfort level. You don't want to be doing things that make you uncomfortable driving, even if it is slightly more efficient, because if you're just stressing out the whole time, well, that takes away the enjoyment of even being out on the road. So charge somewhere in the 5 to 10% as your starting point. That's what you should arrive with. And then I would generally unplug somewhere around the 55 to 70% mark, depending on how much range you need to make it to the next supercharger. But definitely, if you're getting below 75 kilowatts, I would say it's probably time to unplug with the Model 3 LFP, because you're probably charging longer than you need to. And also, if you're charging more than half an hour, unless you're just charging while you're doing something else and it happens to be charging, you're probably not being very efficient with your charging, because there's generally not a reason to with a Model 3 in the US with this range and the Supercharger network that we have in 2023. Because my old Model S 70D, if you've been on this channel quite a while, realistically that had a pretty similar rear wheel range to the Model 3 LFP. The Model 3 LFP is rated a lot higher, but I'd say both have a usable range of somewhere in the 150 to 200 mile mark. My old Model S actually had less range than a brand new Model 3 LFP. I think the longest trip I ever did, aside from my range test that I was really diligent about, was about 160 miles, and that was really pushing it. But I was able to get around the entire US, every state in the lower 48, with that Model S 70D in 2019 and 2020. And I never really had any issues. Every once in a while, I would add in Electrify America or other CHAdeMO or CCS station just for better efficiency, but there was never really a time that I couldn't make it somewhere just with the Supercharger network. And that just goes to show you how good that coverage is, and that you really don't need a range monster when you have really good charging and high speed charging pretty much everywhere. If you're on either of the coasts, range and charging is generally not an issue. Through the middle of the country, you want to be a little bit more diligent with planning your charging because you may not have as many options in the same areas. But even this Model 3 rear-wheel drive has so much range, you'll easily get anywhere you need to get in the country. And I wouldn't even think twice of hopping in one and going literally anywhere. That's how much confidence I have that this car is adequate for just about anyone. Of course, the form factor has to work for you. And I did do a recap of my thoughts of this car kind of on a more holistic basis outside of just charging. So if you haven't, definitely check out that video I posted a few weeks ago, right after I was in Texas. But overall, the Model 3 rear-wheel drive LFP is just an absolutely awesome car. The charging is really strong. Generally, you can probably get away with under 15-minute charges on most road trips, especially on either coast. And there's really no reason to be concerned with the charging or the range on this car. So if you haven't already, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. I'd love to hear what you guys think of the Model 3 rear-wheel drive. These cars they just feel right to me. I used to work at Tesla back in 2018, 2019, and I delivered a ton of Model 3s. Obviously, they didn't have the LFP back then, but every time I hop into a Model 3, it just kind of feels like home, if you will. And even though I love my Rivian, every time I drive a Model 3, I'm just like, man, I gotta get one of these. And the search continues to find the right deal, unless I happen to get a really good offer for the Rivian. And I mean, if you wanna make a really good offer, please comment. My email's on the YouTube channel page. But again, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.